As always, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. It's always great to be able to build a little community however we can. And then as we go on, if you have questions or if you have information that you want to share out regarding some of the things we're talking about, please use the chat. It's actually a great way for us to be able to capture things that are happening that we can then share out with a larger network. And it also, I think, makes the conversation richer. So we're going to recap our Creative Sector Advocacy Week, which was January 22nd through the 26th. Lots of things happened. This is the sort of centerpiece was the day at the State House, which was a day of joy, creativity, and visibility. You can see we had the governor, the lieutenant governor, the co-chairs of Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development from the legislature, as well as members of the Tourism and Arts and Cultural Development Committee, all joined us, as well as our co-hosts, Mass Cultural Council, Mass Humanities, Mass Art, Mass Humanities, Mass Art, Arts Boston, Dunamis, Massachusetts Association of Music Educators, and I'm missing one. And
did you say MAPC?
Thank you. Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and then the Network of Arts Administrators of Color all helped co-host that day. And that day included remarks and speeches. We heard from the governor that she planned that very day to release her budget, which included a small increase, about a $500,000 increase recommendation to the Mass Cultural Council budget. We also had performers and artists who displayed their work from across the Commonwealth, and that was made possible thanks to the Mass Cultural Council, a grant from them. So every artist who you saw perform or display their work was compensated with an honorarium. What's really exciting about this day is that we got to show off what we do really well, which is vibrancy and joy. And creativity. And so, there was a great moment towards the end when two young performers from ZoomX got up in front of on the grand staircase and proceeded to perform two amazing songs that actually drew State House security out from their posts so that they could hear and see the performance. So we sort of helped change a little bit inside the building. In addition to that, there were some really excellent advocacy actions and events that happen across the Commonwealth. The Springfield City Creative Collective kicked off Advocacy Week with a 24-hour Zoom live Zoom, where they interviewed folks, shared information, shared updates. We came on to talk about how folks can advocate. There were legislative roundtables held with arts advocates and elected officials that happened with the Cape Cod delegation, with the Springfield delegation, with a group in East Boston, and then there are more on the way. What's really exciting is that this whole week is really about how you don't need permission to advocate, you just can do it. And we were so excited to see how so many people embraced that week. So thank you to everyone who showed up and participated, however felt meaningful to you. It really does make a difference. It was a really nice, strong way to start out what is a very busy last, what is it? It's Kelsey, it's 5 months of the legislative session. Yeah, it's the last 5 months of the legislative session. And we'll get into what that means in a sec. So let's start out with what's happening. This was so I'm going to start just talking for a second. This past week was a big week. It was a milestone week in the legislature because of Joint Rule 10, which is an agreement by which the Senate and the House agree that all bills that have been assigned to committee will be reported out of that committee. And we'll go through a little bit more in detail what that means. But, we have a two-year legislative cycle. So in January of the first year, bills all get filed. And then in February of the second year, all those bills have had some sort of a hearing or consideration, and they have to move on to their next phase. So if we're thinking of this as like an obstacle course, this is like the crag wall from American Gladiator, just to really date myself. But it's an important moment. So you all know that last year in November and December of 2022, Mass Creative went on the road. We spent time with many of you in community talking about what was happening, what challenges you were facing, both as individual artists, as nonprofit arts organizations, and as creative businesses. You talked to us about what you really valued and what you needed to see from government in order to continue to do your work effectively. And so from that, Mass Creative put together our policy pillars, which are sort of the four guiding things that we think about, right? When we're thinking about how we're going to engage and lead and organize advocacy. At the top of the list is the number one, right? Is public investment in arts and culture. We know that the equity that's possible through public investment is enormous, right? Public dollars are not dependent on marketing budgets or the whims or the desires, the personal desires of an individual donor who feels really passionately about one type of art. It allows for a broader distribution of investment and more transparency. And it's one of the reasons that at Mass Creative, we feel so strongly that by increasing state, local, and federal dollars for arts and culture, we're really able to change whose stories, whose art, and whose cultures are celebrated in Massachusetts. We also believe that we're an economy, right? We're a very strong sector in Massachusetts that delivers a real economic value to the state, and we need to be treated that way. And that there's many parts of our economy, right? We have nonprofit organizations, we have small local businesses, we have independent creative workers, and all those folks need to be represented and advanced when we're talking about policy issues. We also heard really loud and clear that folks are really concerned about staying in their communities in Massachusetts. That's both from a housing lens, which we've talked about before on these calls, but also through literally space to make and present your work. And so that's why that became our fourth pillar. And then our third pillar, and then our fourth pillar is about youth and arts. We did, as part of our work in November and December of 2022, we actually did a survey where we asked folks what they really wanted to see, where they saw the opportunity for the greatest change. And by far, it was about making sure that young people had access to creative experiences, opportunities to be creative themselves, and to celebrate their cultures, and that was an incredibly important way that we could really underpin a strong next generation of leadership. So that's how that came along. So those policy pillars then translated into our 5 bills that the creative sector agenda. And if you were at the State House last week, you probably saw one of these handouts that has all 5 bills. And those are the bills that we've been working on with all of you for the last year and a half, and with their sponsors. And so this week we got to know what was going to happen with those bills, right? So there are 5 bills. 3 of the bills were assigned to the Office of the Committee for Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development. The ACE Act, which is the Accessibility and Creative Economy, went to the Joint Committee on Children, Families, and Persons with Disabilities. And then the Downtown Vitality Act went to the Committee on Small Businesses and Community Development. And so, as I said, Wednesday was the deadline by which all the committees had to make some decisions about their bills that they were considering. And so you basically can do 3 things. You can favorably report it, which means that the traffic cop says, yes, you can move forward. It can get sent to study, which basically means that's the very polite way of saying, no, that's not going to happen. Or an extension can be ordered. And that basically is the committee saying, we need more time to make some decisions. Oftentimes when an extension is ordered, it's the nicest way of saying nothing more is going to happen with this bill. But sometimes that can change, right? They need to negotiate a small piece of language change. They need to get the okay from leadership before they can move forward on it. So here's how we fared. Really, really well. We have 5 bills. 4 of those bills continue to have a life this legislative session. It's also important to note that 3 of the 5 bills, the Creative Space Preservation Act, the ACE Act, and the Cultural Equity and Tourism Act, those are all brand new bills. This is the first year that we filed them, and it can take multiple legislative sessions, years even, to get bills to actually get moved out of committee or passed. So this is a really nice record for us as collectively as a unified advocacy effort that we were able to move so many of them forward. Kelsey, do you want to just provide a little insight from your past experience as working as staff for a rep about this process and what this means?
I can offer a little bit. When I worked in the House, I worked for a vice chair, so we saw a little bit of the behind the scenes decision making that happened within the committees. And what this really demonstrates is that enough people made a strong enough case in support of these bills that it was not only on the radars of the committee chairs, but convince the committee chairs that this was a proposal, or that these were proposals that were worth advancing for the remainder of the session. So I really just want to underscore that this didn't happen because Mass Creative asked for the chair's support, but because people around the state and members of the Mass Creative Action Network all weighed in and submitted testimony or testified at the hearings and continued to raise visibility around these issues and these proposals. So just want to say thank you. And this is the sort of energy and movement building that we will need to keep up for the rest of this session to continue to get them to move forward.
Thanks, Kelsey. That is so true. So let's talk about, we're going to come back to this for a second. There is something that ties both our legislative work as well as our advocacy work together that's really exciting. So as I mentioned, a group in East Boston, a group of arts leaders in East Boston had a roundtable conversation with representatives from local and state elected officials and staff. And they talked about what the arts community in East Boston has experienced, what they need. And they talked about the Creative Space Preservation Act with the folks who assembled. This was an effort that Mass Creative worked with Zoomix in Boston to co-host, and included members of the East Boston Artists Association, the Boston Community Music School, Boston Children's Chorus, and a couple of other groups, which Kelsey will include in the chat in a moment. But out of that, the Boston City Council president reached out and said, we're going to do a formal resolution in the Boston City Council to endorse the Creative Space Act. Now, this matters because this is another really clear leading voice from a municipality saying this bill is really important. And the other thing to know is that when government is functioning well, those local elected officials have very strong relationships with our state elected officials. And that's the case in Boston. So it's another really sort of like movement forward to see the city council endorse this bill. And it would not have happened if it hadn't been for those legislative roundtables. So just an enormous amount of thanks to Zoomix for co-hosting that meeting, and for all the attendees for really talking with their elected officials. We can replicate this, right, in any community across the Commonwealth. And the Mass Creative team is happy to work with you all to set up and to design a roundtable conversation with your elected officials. So here's what the rest of the year is going to look like in the legislature. So basically, we're going to shove 2 years of intensive government affairs work into the next 6 months, with the majority of it happening in July. So we can see in February, the big thing is that bills get reported out of committee. In March, those bills, we're going to see what their next stop is. They don't just get reported out of committee and then immediately get a floor vote. Oftentimes they get assigned to another committee for another quality control. Almost all bills that are about spending money will go to the Ways and Means Committee. And so they have the largest number of bills that they have to move and sift through. And as we've talked about before, those two Ways and Means Committee on the House and the Senate side are also working on another really big project at this point, which is the budget. So you can see in April, the House is going to take up their budget. We'll get into more detail in a moment about that. And then May, the Senate will take up their budget. And then in June, the major focus will be around negotiating the differences between those two versions of the budget to come up with a unified version that the legislature can vote on in July and send to the governor to sign. So you heard me not mention like a lot more hearings or like a lot more things happening with the bills, because frankly, it's really unpredictable to know when more action is going to be taken on those, on all the bills that have been moved forward. A lot of them will be inserted into larger pieces of legislation. That could include the budget, right? There's sometimes policy decisions get included in a budget. It's going to also probably include an economic development bond bill that we expect to come out. Another one is the governor had filed her housing budget, or excuse me, her housing bill, and we expect some more movement with that. And that might be a place to drop in other bills, bill language from bills that have moved out of committee. So one of the things that we work on at Mass Creative is trying to identify those opportunities, work and talk with the committee chairs of those who have control over those different bills, and then work with you all to make sure that you know what's happening in that process so that you can advocate effectively to your legislators to say, we really need you to support this being included in this particular larger legislative vehicle, right? But it's gonna be like a little catch as catch can. So do not unsubscribe from our emails. We promise that we don't believe in spamming you. We do believe in making sure you have the information you need to be a super confident and effective advocate. And so in July, that's when everything has to be basically done, right? The budget has to be done. Those bills, decisions about those bills have to be made. And if they aren't passed by the end of July, that's it. They're done for the session. And again, as I mentioned, bills are filed and refiled multiple times before they actually get passed. But that's something that we're also going to be looking at in terms of like, if a bill dies, should we think about refiling it next year? And frankly, we're going to come to you all with those questions when we do our next policy input sessions to get ready for the next legislative session. The other thing I wanted to mention about this is that, nope, I don't have that thought, sorry. So this is sort of the timeline that we're working on. The other thing to know is that after July, because this is the end of the second year of the session, and the formal session ends at the end of July, is that most of our legislators are going to be running for re-election or are going to be running for open seats. And we're tracking those open seats because we know that you all work closely with us on our Create the Vote efforts. And so one of the things is that like, that's why they want to get all the work done by the end of July so that they can go run for office. And that's also a really great time for us to engage with candidates running for office to talk about what we need next and to thank them for what they've been able to accomplish with us. So what should you do? We're going to probably put together a guide for actions you can take. But in general, if you feel particularly passionate about one or more of these bills, first, if you haven't had a chance, please formally endorse the bills on our website. That allows us to make sure that if we're sending out communications specifically about the Creative Space Preservation Act, that you're on that list. So that's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is look up who your legislators are, and if they are on the committee that moved those bills forward, write them a note. Thank them for it. Say, this is a really meaningful piece of legislation to me because I am part of a cultural district and I know how much it takes to make sure a cultural district actually functions, and we need more investment. So thank you for moving forward the Downtown Vitality Act. The next thing is once we know where those bills are being assigned or what the next action that we're going to take, we'll share that out with you, but be sure to be on the lookout and be ready to talk with your elected officials and say, we know that this is going to be included in the economic development bond bill. We really encourage you to support that when you're talking with leadership, and encourage them to make sure that stays in the final version of the bill. But we're going to need to continue to keep up the advocacy activity that we were able to do over the last 18 months for this next period of time in order to just keep the spotlight on the things that we care most about. As I mentioned, there's a lot of bills, there's a lot of activity, there's a budget, so it's easy for our legislators to get distracted, and we can help them by reminding them why these pieces of legislation are so meaningful to our sector. All right, I'm going to move us on to the budget. So those of you who follow, you may have seen that January revenue reports came in, and it is not good news. So at the end of December, beginning of January, the Secretary of Administration and Finance, as well as others within the government, worked to revise our state revenue forecasts. Right? Like the way that we look at this is we think we're going to make this month and the this much money in the month of January, and that's going to, and that's good, and that'll keep us on pace, and that way we know what we can expect in February to be able to pay for, right? Just like if you're putting together your budget for your business or your nonprofit, if you don't make those ticket sales, if those donors don't come in, you have a problem, right? You have to start being serious about what you're able to continue to do. And unfortunately, even after the revised forecast, the revenues in January did not meet that revised forecast. So we need to be prepared that this is going to be a pretty difficult budget process this year. I would say, if those of you who are longtime advocates, this is going to feel a lot more like a 2016, 2017 budget. We are out of sort of like large amounts of federal money that can be distributed from COVID and from other investments that have happened. So we're really we're on shaky ground. And so we've heard that House leadership has communicated that this is going to be a very conservative budget. We're not going to see a lot of increases on budget lines, and we should be bracing ourselves for maybe decreases. So what do we know? We know that our long-term goal at Mass Creative and with all of you is to get to a $5 per capita spending level for arts and culture. That would mean about $35 million annually going to the Mass Cultural Council. This past year, in fiscal year 24, we were able to get it to $25 million, right? That's great. That's fantastic news. We know the governor released her budget proposal, and it's at $25.5 million. And we know that the Mass Cultural Council formally requested $28 million for this year. So what are we going to do? We're going to ask for what we need, and what we need is $28 million. And then we're going to be prepared to defend what we've secured, right? And so that could mean, that's going to mean you're probably going to see a lot more messages from Mass Creative urging you to reach out to your lawmakers to ask them to support potentially a budget amendment if the House and the Senate versions of the budget come in lower than $25 million, right? We definitely need to make sure that it stays at 25, if not stays at 25.5, which is the governor's recommendation. And so I would just be prepared for that. We are going to talk about the fact that there is a lot more need in our sector, and frankly, a lot more potential with increased investment in our sector, but we are going to defend what we've secured. All right. So what does this process look like? So you all have seen this timeline before if you've been on this call. So we are March. They've actually already started a little bit already, but the House Ways and Means has started their hearings. They actually had one this week. So that's where they hear from all state departments and other folks that they invite to attend to talk about what their budget requests are. So we can expect the Mass Cultural Council will be invited to one of the hearings that the Ways and Means is holding to talk about their request and what that request will do for our sector. We will update you when that happens. We can expect in April that the House Ways and Means will release their version of the budget. Then that will be the opportunity for members of the House to file amendments that can include increases to specific budget lines, can include earmarks for particular projects in their communities. And that's the point where, if needed, we're hoping that a legislator will file an amendment to increase the Mass Cultural Council budget, and we'll let you know about that. By the end of April, we expect that the House will pass their version of the budget, and it'll move over to the Senate, where the cycle will begin again with Senate Ways and Means releasing their version of the budget, amendments being offered, and then a final version being put together. In June, we expect conference committee. Again, as I said earlier in this call, that'll be the negotiating between the two different versions of the budget. And then if we're really optimistic, and this is the most optimistic timeline, the budget gets sent to the governor in July. As many of you know, oftentimes that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in July. It gets sent in September. And then the governor has 10 days to decide what to do with that, whether or not to sign it, to veto it, or to line item veto it. If the governor vetoes it or does a line item veto, it goes back to the legislature, and the legislature has the power to override those vetoes. So that's going to be the process. And so you can expect updates from us along the way around that. Kelsey, anything to add to the budget process here in Massachusetts?
I don't have anything additional to add. I am also responding to Blair's question in the chat right now about budget implications with the bills that are advancing.
Oh, great. Do you, yeah, so that's a really great question, Blair. So I can't see the chat because of how we were set up. So Kelsey, do you want to share with an update verbally?
Yeah, I can do that. So the short answer, Blair, is the Creative Space Preservation Act is not a money bill, which makes this an opportune time to advocate for that legislation. Downtown Vitality Act, Place Act, and the ACE Act are all money bills, and they have different formulas baked into each of them. So the funding mechanisms look a little different for all of them. That being said, we can and will work with the committees to redraft those parts of the legislation where money is concerned, to come or arrive at a formula that makes more sense for just the resources we're dealing with right now. So we don't need to be terribly concerned about how much we're asking for outright in the Place Act if we can work with the committee chairs and their staff to tweak the formula and at least establish the rest of the proposals that are contained within the bill. So that's not a, because it involves money or requires money does not mean that we need to rule it out or assume that it's not going to move any further, if that's helpful.
Just to also add here, I think that oftentimes we like get caught in a little bit of a like logic trap, right? Which is, oh my gosh, if we ask for more money over here, then it's going to get decreased from the Mass Cultural Council budget. That's not really the way it works, right? We can look at other sectors that are pulling in state support in a lot of different ways from a lot of different pots of money. And so I think we need to sort of, even in this moment where it feels really stressful, where it feels like, oh my gosh, revenues are down, 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 we still need to live in a mode of abundance, of saying like our sector is worthy and requires the kinds of investments and be taken seriously as an economic sector. So I think both those pieces, right? What Kelsey's saying about being strategic and thoughtful about the moment we're in, but also not sort of limiting us to say, or allowing, frankly, other people to limit us in terms of what we can and can't ask for. Like if we can kind of merge those two lines of thought, we're gonna be able to be much more successful as a sector.
Yeah, and if I can just add one more thing to that. So I think it makes a lot of sense that during a tough budget year, we might get shy about asking for things that require money. But we have seen that even throughout the pandemic, the sector continues to grow and is generating revenue for the state. We all know that the sector contributes more than economic value to the state, but where we need to make the argument for the economic value that we do generate, we know that if we were to pass a bill, like I'll use the Downtown Vitality Act as an example right now, that would take money that's already being collected and invested into the general fund. If we reinvest that back into these communities to make them walkable, where we can promote small businesses and communities just at the hyper local level, that will help the state's economy as a whole. So we can do both. We can recognize that we're dealing with a tough fiscal climate, but also make a stronger argument for all of the ways in which the sector does bolster the broader economy and how public investments into the sector will help the economy as a whole at a time where we really need that.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay. So we've sort of covered what happens now and sort of how we're going to engage in our advocacy. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And if folks have more questions, you can feel free to use the chat